I'm very happy to be here, and just to say it from the start, I mean, this is a bite-sized session, quite focused on people who have not been this exposed to the rules yet, but we're very happy to take more specific questions after the session, after that presentation, or also after that session. So if we go to, well, Amy already said it, my name is Alexander von Westernhagen. I've been an EU competition lawyer for over 20 years, 15 of them in the UK, but I also have vast experience at EU level in Brussels. I used to work for the European Commission in a prior life, but as I said, I have been working from the UK in the last 15 years. So what we're going to talk about today, we don't have so much time, but just to remind ourselves of the rules, and also for those of you who don't have that detailed overview yet. So introduction, why are we where we are today? So, you know, what are the changes? What has triggered the changes? Then tariffs, the basics, also tariffs under other international agreements. How does that fit into the TCA, our trade and cooperation agreement that we're dealing with here today mainly? Then we're coming to the rules of origin under the TCA, the basics for those of you who are not aware of them, and then also an overview of what are originating products under the TCA. Those of you who have a lot of experience will know that the most difficult ones are those in relation to products which consist of material which is from third countries, but we're going to look into this in a bit more detail. And then we're going to come to how to claim preferential treatment under the TCAs, again, the basics, and then exported related responsibilities, because as we know at the moment, exporters are more heavily under focus than importers. And last but not least, a very quick overview of what should be considered in contracts due to these changes and to the extent that this hasn't been dealt with yet. So if you now go to the next slide, just a couple of definitions, the common terms that we're going to use. So rules of origin, I've also abbreviated these as ROO because the word is really long. And then businesses, well, what does this mean? Traders, individuals, or manufacturers. I mean, they're interchangeable here. Tariffs means duties or taxes. Preferential treatment, so the TCA provides preferential treatment that can mean preferential access, preferential taxes. In our case here, it means zero tariff rates. What you will know that parties, when we refer to parties, we mean the UK and the EU. When referring to the TCA, at least production, very important for the rules of origin to understand that that means really working or processing. And as we're going to see, some processes are insufficient. And in that context, you know, you're going to see that this has an impact on how your products are being treated under the rules of origin of the TCA or any other free trade agreement for that matter. But last but not least, products, that will be goods and items. Just a very brief overview, you know, as to important terms. If you now go to the next slide. So again, I said we're going to have a small introduction, just a reminder to put our presentation into context. So as you all know, the UK ceased to be part of the EU Customs Union and the internal market at the end of December 2020. I will really explain what that means, because it's very often people do not appreciate what that means in factual terms. So that's why I thought it would be good to just see what is meant by this. And so instead, the UK is now being treated under EU and EU member state law as a third country for the purpose of trade in goods and also, as we know, of services, but that's not what we're going to look into here today. So since the 1st of January, we have had the TCA, the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I've put here the link of the official government version, which was published in April, because if you Google the TCA, you're still going to find the older version. This is the version which is much more user-friendly because it has a different numeration, and also the annexes are much clearer, so I highly recommend using this version here. And so what we're going to talk about today, what we're going to focus is really the implications for traders from Great Britain. So what they should watch out for exporting goods from Great Britain into the EU, as well as to what extent the new rules require you to change contracts in due course. And so there are, as we all know, special arrangements for Northern Ireland. We're not going to talk about those. I know they create quite a lot of struggle in practice as well, but that could fill easily a long session just on Northern Ireland, and so that might be for another day. So if we now go to the next slide, I said we're going to have a quick reminder of the EU Internal Market and Customs Union. So what is that? So the EU Customs Union was established in '67, and it means that customs duties on third countries, so the external tariffs, are harmonized across the EU. I have a slide, the next slide will show that in a bit more detail. And so that means that the EU member states, they do not impose tariffs on each other's goods, but they do impose an external tariff on the external borders of the EU to any other good that enters the EU. And that internally reduces the need for customs checks, obviously, because once a good has entered, whether it's entered Italy or France, and it's then in that customs union, because there are no customs checks internally, because there are no tariffs, that's where the good can then easily flow internally. And that's where also where the internal market comes in. So you might remember the internal market was established in the 90s due to a very nice gentleman who brought that into place, Arthur Cockburn. And he established that in order for these goods to work freely and move freely within the member states, there must be a EU-wide or even EU-wide harmonization of how these goods must look like, so standards. And when I talk about EEA, I mean the three countries which are in the European Economic Area, so Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. They are in the internal market, but they're not in the customs union. And this is, for example, why there's been this recent agreement with Norway, for example. So that's just as a broad overview. The next slide shows what I mean by this in practice. So you see here some light blue countries and some dark blue countries. So the dark blue countries, that's the EU and the EU Customs Union. It should, for the time being at least, still have that here in dark blue, because as I alluded to, Northern Ireland is treated for the purposes of free movement of goods, at least for the moment, still treated as being part of the customs union. And so that the dark blue bits are the EU Customs Union. And as I said, wherever a good enters, it must, be checked. But once it has entered one of these borderlines, then it can move freely. The light countries here, that's Norway, you have Liechtenstein, Iceland, they do not participate in the customs union, but they are in the internal market. So once the good has entered this part here, then it can also freely move to these parts. I just thought that would be good for us to have as a quick overview before we move on to the more, the complex nitty-gritty, but just to see why these changes have come along. And they obviously have an impact on what we're going to talk about here today. So the fact that we now have a different system and a separation, that obviously means that we have tariffs now. The TCA, as we will see, has established preferential tariffs or zero tariffs, and also no quantitative restrictions. However, in order to avoid that somebody abuses these rules and then, introduces a good from into Italy and then straight from Italy to Great Britain, these goods must comply with rules of origin requirements. That's why they are so important, because the aim is to avoid that goods which are actually do not qualify for preferential tariffs because they do not come from the EU or from Great Britain, that they are not, do not benefit from the TCA and the zero tariffs. And so that's why we have tariffs now. Obviously, we also have customs checks that apply to movements of goods from Great Britain to the EU, at least when moving goods from Great Britain to the EU. We know, according to the UK-based border model, that this is not going to be introduced until the end of the year. The EU introduced border checks from day one, so from the 1st of January 2021. And because of the exit of the internal market, obviously, there will also be product regulations divergence, which has an impact also on certificates and other labels and other things you need in order to import products, but we're not going to focus on this here today because we do not have that time available, but maybe another time. So coming to the basics of the tariffs. So tariffs are usually paid on imports and they're payable by the importer. So here in our case, that's the retailer based in the EU for imports from Great Britain or the retailer in Great Britain for imports from the EU. As many of you will know, the importer and the exporter can, however, agree that the exporter pays the tariff, and that is referred to in international standards as delivery duty paid. It doesn't really matter in large volume trade, but sometimes it's applied. So again, coming back to tariffs and the basics. So for imports into the EU, whatever the good is, wherever it comes from, that we have the common external tariff, the CET, and so that is common to all 27 member states because, as you know, they're all in one customs union. However, the rates of duty differ obviously depending on what good is imported, so because different tariffs apply to different goods and where the good comes from. As we just said, if the good comes from the EU and is imported into Great Britain or vice versa, then provided that the rules of origin are complied with, there are no tariffs. I've also listed, for those of you who are pretty new to this, the tools where tariffs can be checked, both for the CET as well as for the UK global tariff, which has replaced for the UK the EU CET. So that's tariffs, the basics. Just if we go to the next slide, then just finishing up on the basics. As I already said, so the TCA prohibits tariffs on all goods originating in one of the parties. So really key to provide evidence of the goods and where they originate from, whether they originate in the UK for imports from Great Britain into the EU, or goods, whether they originate from the EU for imports from the EU into Great Britain. And so that's why we have a focus on exporters' obligations here today, because as we will see later, the importer heavily depends on the exporter to provide that evidence. So even though it's the importer who is in charge of providing the evidence that goods comply with the rules of origin, because obviously he's the one who would normally have to pay the tariffs, as we just saw, the evidence for this needs to be provided by the exporter. And just a reminder, if that's not the case, then we have a problem. Again, whether tariffs are due in that case, so if the rules are not provided, complied with, then whether tariffs are due, then we look into the CET for whether that the CET stipulates tariffs for that good at all, or what percentage, what kind of tariff, or whether the UK GT foresees tariffs for respective goods that are imported into Great Britain. And so those of you who deal with this on a regular basis will know that the UKGT has quite lower tariffs in many respects, or even zero tariffs for goods where the EU external tariff would apply tariffs. So it's also worth mentioning, because we deal quite a lot with pharmaceuticals in our practice. Obviously, even if the CTA doesn't apply, then there might be another international agreement which applies. And that might be, for example, just give you an example, the WTO agreement for pharmaceutical products. So that's an agreement which has been entered into by numerous countries around the world. And it was very promising when it came, when it was set up, but it hasn't been updated since 2010. It provides many zero tariffs for many different pharmaceutical products, but not to the extent that it could be one would wish for. And so that's where we have, therefore, it's good to see that we also have other requirements in the TCA for those products that aren't captured in particular by the WTO agreement for some pharmaceutical goods. So coming now to, I think, yes, now coming to, may I ask Amy, how are we doing with timing? Unfortunately, I can't see, I should have taken the clock.
Run 20 past 12.
20 past, okay, fantastic. Well, we're going to speed up a little bit. But so coming to the rules of origin requirements, so they're set out in two parts. And again, I highly recommend using that version from the UK government of April, which is in the slides. So importantly, we do have two parts on rules of origin. So the general provisions, which are under Part 2, Heading 1, Title 1, Chapter 2. These are, as the name says, rules that apply to all products that are being traded under preference, and that includes the primary and administrative requirements. So anything of a general nature, I'm going to come to some of the most important articles in a short while. They're set out in that general part. And then we have in annexes 2 and 3, we have product-specific rules of origin. And they quite handily, there are some really useful explanatory notes which have been introduced into the updated version. And so they really explain in an easy to understand way what is meant by certain terms that we need for the rules of origin calculations. So for example, what is meant to by price, what is meant to by value, how do you calculate this? All this is set out in the annex, and there are specific provisions for really literally every term that might be useful in looking into then Annex 3, which sets out the specific rules for every product and the conditions for that product to be considered originating. As many of you will know, that's based on harmonized system codes. And again, why do we need it? Because we want to avoid that products are being traded between the two jurisdictions, which do actually not come from one of these jurisdictions. So coming into the next slide, thank you. So just looking briefly into the general provisions. So what does it actually mean, originating, that a product must be originating in the UK or the EU? So there are three possibilities. A product might be wholly obtained in a party, so wholly obtained products. Second would be products produced in that party exclusively from originating materials. So in other words, you have two wholly obtained products that are then being produced as another product. And last but not least, really last but not least, products produced in that party that are incorporating non-originating material, provided they satisfy the requirements set out in the PSRs. So the third one is obviously the difficult one. That's why we're going to have a quick look into it shortly. But before doing so, very important to know what applies is bilateral cumulation. So in other words, materials originating in one of the parties are usually considered as originating in the other party as well, which is very important and useful, especially for supply chains and where products are produced by sending them back and forth between the jurisdictions. So that's where bilateral cumulation can be extremely helpful and useful. Now coming to the next slide, so just briefly looking into what does wholly obtained mean. So our products exclusively stemming from one party, as we said. The goods also mustn't have been manipulated or changed in another country, apart from certain minimal processes to keep them in good conditions. So freezing, for example, might be applicable in that regard, or similar procedures. So examples in that context are minerals extracted from the soil of one of the parties, or live animals that have been born and raised in the territory of one of the parties, or goods produced in one of the parties from materials that are exclusively sourced from there. So these would all be wholly obtained products, but much more complicated, as we will see on the next slide, is actually what are products incorporating non-originating material. So that's a more complicated situation. For example, if you manufacture a car, and so the engine comes from Japan, then you would have material used originating from a third country. And in that context, I shall add what's not been applied under the TCA. So we do have correlation between the parties, but we do not have correlation with other countries with which the parties have a free trade agreement. So that can sometimes happen in free trade agreements that, for example, in my case, with the engine from Japan, you might think, okay, if there is a zero tariff under the free trade agreement between the UK and Japan, that might then help with the rules under the TCA, but it doesn't. It remains a third country, third party material, and therefore we cannot add it under the correlation. On the other hand, if we comply with the product-specific rules for products incorporating non-originating material, let's say, you have an engine which is produced 30% of material which comes from a third country, and then that engine, however, complies with the product-specific rules for that kind of material product, then even though that product has an input of 30% coming from a third country, once it has passed the specific rules of origin, it will be treated as originating from the UK or the EU as a whole. So you don't have to look into the rules of origin again once an input has classified as coming through these products rules for products incorporating non-originating material. So importantly, what are then the circumstances where products incorporating non-originating materials might still qualify as originating? So the main examples are the product has been sufficiently transformed. So in other words, the materials have been transformed to something that results in a change of tariff classification. So if you have different inputs for a car, then the car itself will have a different tariff classification as the inputs. That would be obviously sufficient transformation. Another possibility, depending on the product used, is the value or weight of non-originating material, and whether that falls below a certain maximum level. So to illustrate this, I think we have it on the next slide. yeah, so what does that mean in practice? Change of tariff classification. That method looks at whether the manufacturing process carried out in a country resulted in a change of tariff classification. So for example, as already mentioned, when automobile components are imported and then transformed into a completed car, that would be a tariff change, tariff classification change. Importantly, however, and really worth reading through in detail is, for example, what is insufficient production. So that is set out in Article 43 of the general part of the TCA. And so that makes it very clear. So for example, I had to deal with an example recently where cereals were placed together, cereals coming from different parts of Europe and also third countries. And so the glazing of cereals is not sufficient to make that a different product. And so it's the remained cereals. So if you have certain kinds of production, sometimes I must say it's not really always logical. I don't find it always super straightforward to say, okay, this is insufficient production, but you see in Article 43, there are some scenarios when you read them in combination with Annex 3 and the route, the specific routes, then you see that will not lead to sufficient production. So I mentioned the other case are tolerance levels. They differ depending on the good imported into the EU or Great Britain. So for example, pharmaceutical products, they have in many respects a maximum level of non-originating material, which is 50%. So that means 50% of the overall product can come from third non-originating material. It's also referred to as max norm in the TCA. And again, so the notes in Annex 2, they set out a calculation formula how to calculate the max norm of a product. I think when we now go to the next slide, we have another poll. That's also always nice. So
yes, so our next poll is, what have you considered in terms of customs with the EU? We're interested in knowing what you're doing, and we'll give it a couple of seconds for you to answer. Thank you. So we have 67% are using an existing customs agent, 10% are doing them themselves. We still have some companies who are undecided or to whom this is not applicable. Thank you. And I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. So, oh, yeah. Just very briefly, so how do you claim then preferential treatment under the TCA? So as we said, so it's on the importer to provide the proof of origin to demonstrate that the goods qualify as originating. And so how do you provide this proof? It can take two forms, either a statement on origin, which is completed by the exporter on a commercial document. I'm going to very briefly talk about this in a minute, or knowledge obtained and held by the importer that the goods are originating. The government has kindly set out in guidance what that should include. The information, I didn't put it here because it's quite lengthy, but it's actually quite logical what you need. So you need to provide evidence that the goods are originating, which is very similar in practice to a statement on origin, I would say. So preferential treatment can then be claimed up to 3 years after the date of importation. So it doesn't have to be done straight away, but you have some time to do it. So just a summary on exporters related responsibilities. So what does an exporter have to do? A GP exporter, so hold the evidence that the goods meet the relevant ROs before issuing a statement on origin, and check whether a supplier's declaration needs to be attained. So what is a supplier's declaration? Reminder, that's a declaration that a GP supplier provides the exporter with information needed to prove the origin of goods for preferential trade. As we might know, at the moment, we still have a grace period for this until the end of December from both sides. So there is no need to provide a supplier's declaration right now. But that might be required retrospectively, or will certainly be required retrospectively. So something to be aware of. So holding evidence, checking whether a supplier's declaration is needed. On the next slide, just finishing up on the exported related responsibilities. What else does the exporter have to do? Provide the customer, so the importer, with one of the following: statement on origin. Handily, there's a form of words set out in Annex 7 for the text of the TCA. And so that can be provided in a commercial invoice or other commercial document that describes the goods, and a supporting document and records if the customer, so the importer, is claiming preference based on importer's knowledge. And all these records must be maintained by the exporter for at least 4 years under the TCA. Briefly on the supplier's declaration, so can be provided at any time, even after the goods have been delivered. When will that be, might that be necessary? So the supplier might be asked to provide a supplier's declaration to the exporter to provide either that the goods meet the rules of origin, or that the supplier has processed and added value to the goods, if you had goods with non-preferential origin status. And the exporter, on the other hand, as we can imagine now that we know a little bit the balance between the exporter and importer, may need to get a supplier's declaration to prove the origin of the materials if they have used that themselves in a manufacturing process, or for finished products that the exporter has bought and re-exported. So as a wholesaler. So that was what I wanted to say in our bite-sized session on rules of origin and tariffs, and what are the main obligations for the exporter. Just very briefly, what is the impact on contracts? That's obviously really interesting also for us lawyers. What has happened, we had quite a few agreements, for example, where we had fixed prices because there were long-term agreements, and then the question was, is this a change of routes which enables the fixed price to be re-evaluated because there are new trading routes? That really depends on the terms, worth checking. And also, I mean, for example, for PFI contracts, what are the recovery facilities or possibilities for additional costs due to non-sector specific changes of law? So depending on the sector you are in, that might be worth looking at if you haven't done so yet, apart obviously from the specific obligations that need to be implemented for the exporter and the importer. So I think that's all I wanted to say in this brief session. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know what time it is and whether we still have time for questions. Apologies if I have run over.
Yeah, I think we've got around 5 minutes left for questions, so that's great. I can see some in the chat.
Fantastic.
Whilst we're just having a look at the questions, if we can just ask you to complete our final poll. I know Alexandra's particularly interested in this one. So how have you found the movement of goods since the 1st of January 2021, sorry. Just a few more seconds to get your votes in. Thank you, Yearly Viz. So around 38% of you have found this moderately difficult. 24% very difficult, and 14% moderately easy. So thanks for filling these in. We're collecting this feedback fortnightly.
Interesting, yeah, interesting. It's really very different depending on who you ask, but shall we take some questions?
Yeah, we've got some questions on the chat. And the first one is, we are selling goods made in the EU to a Norway customer. Is there any chance that our Norway customer can get preferential rate on duty for these products?
Well, not under the TCA, because Norway is not in the customs union. So there are an internal market, but I mean, if you're not processing these goods somehow, so if this remains the same good and you're just selling it on, you know, from the UK, from Great Britain to Norway, I wouldn't see how it could qualify for any form of preferential treatment under the TCA already, because you are, yeah, you're not sufficiently processing the goods. Amy, would you agree? Or, you know,
yeah, I think with some of these questions, we may need to understand just a little bit more about what you're doing. So that's obviously the broad answer, and if there is some kind of processing of things, then be something that we could obviously into in a little more detail.
Yeah.
Our next question is, are materials from Norway considered originating or not originating?
Because Norway is not in the customs union, so unfortunately, it's therefore not considered originating, because it's a third country. This is why this little map at the beginning, you know, I know some people are really bored by it, but so these light blue countries, they are literally countries that are not in the customs union, and therefore they cannot, also for accumulation purposes, they can't be taken into account, unfortunately. So that is not possible.
Thank you. We've got another question here, and it's, what if we export a product not for sale, but for a test or trial, and then comes back? Do we need still to pay duty?
Well, that's a good question. But I mean, I would say if it enters the customs union, then obviously it will be checked. And so unless it doesn't really enter the customs union, so there are, you know, processes that are taking place in duty-free. So, for example, we have the free ports now in the UK, but otherwise I wouldn't see how it wouldn't attract customs, because it's introduced into the territory. And so whether it's then made for resale, made available for resale or not, will be difficult to control afterwards. So I would say it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think unless you're tapping into some of the special customs procedures, which we can obviously give you some more information about, and you can look into whether it may be you able to access any of those special procedures.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question is, what happens if the contribution to the product is software and has no weight?
Excuse me? I can't see any questions anymore. Are they coming in here in our
on the chat? Yes, on the chat box.
I think they're in the chat, the little bubble, as well as the Q&A box.
Excuse me, let me just check. Excuse me, where is that question?
Almost at the bottom. It says, what if our contribution to the product is software and therefore it has no weight?
It depends, really. I would have to check the specific rules for software, but it's not really always weight which is decisive. It could be value, but I would have to check the specific rules for software.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few questions in one, so I think we'll probably take that offline and have a little bit of a look and get back to you. The last one is, how long is evidence of origin required to be kept for exported products? I think you mentioned that, Alexandra.
Yes, it's 4 years.
Like we said, we are recording this session, and we're going to share the slides with you. If you have any specific questions that need more tailored responses, then please send them through. Once we send the follow-up email, we can obviously connect you with Alexandra if you want in some more one-to-one support as well. Don't forget, if you do need any help with Origin, there's still the SME Brexit support fund available, up to £2,000 per company, that can help you to get some more specific advice and people to look at rules of origin for you internally. You need to apply by the end of this month, and the money has to be spent by the end of August. So we will obviously share some details as well on that grant if you've not already applied and you want to tap into that.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Amy. Very important point. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for today. It's been really good session, very informative. Hopefully you've all found something useful and you've all learned something today. Like we said, any more questions, please send them through. Have I missed anything, Liz?
No, I think that's it. Everything else we can take offline. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. Wow. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you again.